Hi, I'm Julia.
And I'm Isaac.
We are friends, amateur musicians, and music lovers who believe that full albums are an art form all their own, greater than the sum of their parts.
This is For the Record, a podcast where we turn off shuffle, ditch the algorithm, and listen to one great album from start to finish.
Today, instead of talking about just one album, like we will be doing on this podcast, we wanted to give a little introduction, explaining why we're here and what we're here to do. As part of that, we also wanted to give our listeners a little glimpse into the history of albums in music, their rise, their fall, and where the music world stands on albums now.
You can follow us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Julia, I think I'm addicted to listening to albums. It's starting to become a problem, but also not, because it brings me a lot of joy. And just to maybe dive into why we're doing this podcast.
Sure. Does it spark joy? Big question.
Yes, and that's why I keep it around. Shout out Marie Kondo. I actually started off this year with a New Year's resolution to listen to more full albums. I mean, it was sort of the goal I set myself was to listen to at least one full album a day.
Isaac, that's really crazy.
It gets crazier. Mostly new albums, some albums from that I'd heard before, but not in a while. Some new artists completely, some old artists where I hadn't just given their albums the full time of day. And I did it as a project to kind of expand my palette. I wanted to be exposed to new music. I wanted to get to know artists that I already loved even more deeply, maybe check in with some songs that you don't hear. I mean, if you grew up with like a greatest hits album of a certain artist,
love those,
you have a very specific and limited view of an artist that you love honestly, but incompletely.
For me, that's Steve Miller Band. I had the greatest hits, and Queen. Those are my two. Embarrassingly, I love the greatest hits.
It's a great resource, but it does remove some of what we're looking to explore on this podcast. I will say, just to brag or maybe incriminate myself, I've listened to over 750 albums this year as part of my album project. So I'm at one a day. There were some days I didn't do any. There were some days I did like 7 in one day.
Isaac, you do understand that you're almost at 2 a day. There's only 365 days in the year, and there's a week left in December.
I probably should get out more.
But that's why I picked you to do this project with me. You, I think in Q1, sent me a spreadsheet just totally unprompted, and I opened it having no idea what it was, and found it was a list of albums with a rating and a date you listened, some interesting notes. And I thought, wow, here's someone that loves music way more than I could ever aspire to. And while that was kind of intimidating, it really just, I don't know.
Well, that I think led to us just more consistently sharing music, sharing albums, sharing our thoughts, yapping in person and over text about music, artists we love, etc.
What excites us, what inspires us.
Expressing grief and disgrace when the other person didn't share their love for a certain album.
Until you're on the Sabrina Carpenter train, I'm not letting it go.
I love Sabrina. I'm just not as much as you.
So anyway, we started talking about making a podcast, and placing albums at the center felt like a great way to take the way we were already thinking and talking about music in our personal lives, to infuse it with even greater depth and push us to listen to music more closely, to do more research. At the end of the day, we're nerds, and we're music nerds, and we just wanted to put our thoughts on the music we love into words.
We just wanted a good excuse for spending way too long on Wikipedia and the doldrums of rock reviews, past and present.
I do love a deep dive.
I think for both of us, both before starting this podcast and through sort of getting it up and running, we've, as much as we already love listening to and engaging with music, we've really found it as an opportunity to dig deeper, think more deeply about how and why music is made, artists' intentions, etc.
I think coming from a radio background, this was a shift for me, largely inspired by your album project, to start approaching music less as a song-based endeavor to a more album-based experience, which I think really does offer a deeper and more enriching experience. It helps me to think about music the way I think about books. And you and I also discuss books. We discuss films. That could have been a separate podcast. But my point is, if you were reading a book, you wouldn't pick a few random chapters. And I think a good way to think of an album is its chapters telling a story that the artist has written, and it's only complete if you read all of them in the order that the artist chose.
Totally. I think it's a great comparison.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's great that we're giving ourselves the opportunity
and going on this journey
to nerd out about music. I think it's fair to say that the thesis statement of this podcast is that a great album should be greater than the sum of its parts. Yeah. And a great album, when you listen to it straight through, should give you something more than just your relationship with the artist or how you feel about any given song. And part of that too, and understanding the way that albums as a format actually shaped how music was made, not just technologically speaking, but the ideas that musicians were putting into their art.
Yeah. I would say even the history of the album has led us to the album that we know and love today.
And beyond it. I mean, here in the live from the streaming era.
Yes, so true.
So we wanted to take the opportunity to dive into that history a little bit, give context for how the album came about, the technological and musical innovations that both led to it and were inspired by it, and just talk a little bit about how music listening has evolved over time.
Now, welcome to Julia and Isaac discuss the history of the album.
Today, I feel like we take the album for granted, but the history of the album begins before the album, more than 100 years ago. So let's set the scene. It's the early 20th century. The idea of recording and owning and playing music is a fledgling technology. It's still kind of a novelty.
Yeah.
More than that, it was expensive. I mean, you had to own expensive technological equipment and discs that held the music just to be able to listen to music in your own home. The music that you had to own was what's known as singles. And we hear that word still used today. There's a lot of holdover terminology that now means something slightly different at first, but singles were individual plastic discs that would spin at 78 RPM, which is revolutions per minute.
That was on a phonograph?
Yes, invented by Thomas Edison in the late 1800s.
Who would have thought that for me to have a podcast where all I want to do is talk about Sabrina Carpenter, I would need to be referencing Thomas Edison?
Julia, the whole point of this podcast is that Sabrina and Thomas are in conversation with each other in the rich history of albums. These singles could only hold one song on each side. They were about 3 to 4 minutes each. Early jazz, blues, and big band musicians were kind of the kings of this format just because that was the popular music at the time. But because of the physical limitations meant that only a single song could fit on each side, there was really no idea of an album as a single body of work, which was, I think, limiting but also liberating in some hands. Like, you couldn't own a symphony at home, but artists were pushed to create catchy, earworm-filled songs that people wouldn't mind listening to endlessly.
Yeah, for 3 or 4 minutes.
Exactly. That started to change in the 30s when...
The 1930s.
The 1930s, yes. Not the future. When Columbia Records introduced the idea of the air quotes album as a literal book of these small discs, these 78. So it was like a photo album, you know, it's not...
Yeah, just all they flip through the records.
Exactly. Like they exist still as individual snippets, but just the idea of compiling things together, you know, you could compile a longer work like a symphony. And yes, someone would have to get up and switch the discs and flip, you know, put the needle on the phonograph back on to get through all of Beethoven's Fifth. But just the idea that people would want to listen to music in a more lengthy way was a turning point.
And then I think the first pivotal moment is really 1948. When Columbia Records introduces the 12-inch long play record, otherwise known as the LP, which I'm sure most of you have already heard of. And that disc spins at 33 1/3 RPMs. And that gives about 20 to 25 minutes of uninterrupted music. So this is more of the record that you guys might recognize as something you maybe had at home. Music didn't need to be short anymore. So artists could start to think a bit broader in terms of publishing a body of work, not just fragments.
It's kind of like if a painter was only working on printer paper, A2 printer paper, and then suddenly was given a wall-sized canvas.
Yeah, the opportunities were becoming endless.
Some of the early adopters came from the classical and jazz world. I mean, classical because these symphonies were written as longer pieces of work, and suddenly they could be captured in, you know, maybe 2 or 3 discs as opposed to 30.
Yeah.
And for jazz musicians who love to improvise and really find room to breathe on stage.
Yeah.
The LP offered them the chance to replicate that in the studio. So
Miles Davis, Kind of Blue,
Dave Brubeck,
Time Out. Yeah.
they were shaped to fit this format. And though they were comprised of individual songs, they also contained concepts, ideas, sounds, motifs, etc., that had room to create threads and through lines through the album, and they could be structured like a narrative with peaks and valleys and climaxes.
And then, comes rock and roll.
Hell yeah, baby.
So the rise of rock and roll was a musical revolution. This is them pulling from jazz and blues that defined the first half of the 20th century and infusing those sounds and ideas with the buzz that could be produced by electric instruments and amplifiers. So by the 1960s, rock music began experimenting with the LP format, which took full advantage of this longer runtime that we've been talking about. And singles were still driving radio waves, but albums had become a canvas for artistry and innovation. So it wasn't just about selling music anymore. It was about crafting an experience that would cohesively capture the sound and artistry of a band at a given point in time.
A key moment in this sort of rock revolution, both musically and in regard to the album, came in the mid-60s when the Beatles released Rubber Soul, which was a turning point album for them. It's considered one of the first albums where the songs were conceived as a unified work rather than just a collection of singles.
I think this is my favorite Beatles album, if I'm being honest. I've always been a Rubber Soul girl.
I think it's a great choice, and it stands out in their catalog as the turning point from being these top of the charts pop heartthrobs to starting to think about music more expansively, more psychedelically.
Yeah, this is a period where they're starting to experiment more, I think, with musical styles. The lyrics become a bit more sophisticated. There is a maturity in their songwriting that I think, they were the biggest pop act in the world, and they inspired other musicians to view albums also as vehicles for artistic expression rather than just commercial products.
So across the Atlantic, the Beach Boys took note of Rubber Soul, which I think almost like Rubber Soul almost feels like they didn't know they were creating a concept album.
Yeah.
It just worked out that way. And the Beach Boys took that.
Cue Brian Wilson.
Clapped back with the release of Pet Sounds.
One of the world's greatest albums.
Totally. And the Beach Boys' magnum opus. This was 1966, by the way. And yeah, the Beach Boys frontman, Brian Wilson, really pushed the boundary of studio techniques. He layered in lush harmonies, complex instrumental arrangements, while still keeping the catchy hooks and earworms that the Beach Boys were known for. And they approached the album, you pulled this little bit of research, with the idea of creating a teenage symphony to God. Whoa.
Yeah.
Heady stuff. And they just packed this album wall to wall with introspective lyrics, thematic coherence, experimentation in the studio. And it's a sonic masterpiece that demands to be heard in full. I mean, it's so much better for listening to it in full.
And no one recognized that more than the Beatles. This is the beginning of true, competitive inspiration. The Beatles heard Pet Sounds and immediately they were like, we need to get back to the studio. This is the type of album we should be creating. Even though, they had sort of spawned this competition with Rubber Soul, they then put out Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967.
Snaps for that. I mean, it's still today hailed as the definitive moment that the album became an art form. It wasn't just a collection of songs. It was cohesive and thematic, orchestral and introspective. And obviously the Beatles themselves played a huge role, but it's worth shouting out their producer, George Martin, who was, you could kind of think of him as the fifth Beatle. I mean, he was an absolute genius when it came to turning the, incredible songs that these guys were writing into something immersive, even right down to the album art itself, like this psychedelic, multi-faced collection of people, if you know the Sgt. Pepper's album cover, that it almost speaks to the worlds that they were starting to open up with their music. The LP suddenly wasn't just a carrier of songs, it was an art form and an artifact.
And that takes us into the 70s, which I think for a lot of people is like the decade for music. This is a golden age for the LP. Artists across all genres are now treating albums as high concept storytelling vehicles. And I think you'll often hear people say like, oh, I wish that I had been alive in the 70s when it was the heyday of music. And this is a time for progressive rock bands, for example, Pink Floyd, to master what became known as the concept album, which is a singularly cohesive listening experience, which blurs the lines between singular songs and they're, stretching the yarn of story, theme, melody, and weave them seamlessly along the length of the album.
Yeah, The Dark Side of the Moon, 1973 is kind of the quintessential example where one track flows seamlessly into the next. It creates this hour-long immersive journey about time and greed and grief and mental illness. And you can lose yourself in an album like that. Like it's not about, other than when you would have to stand up and physically flip the LP if you're listening to it as a vinyl, you can totally lose yourself in it, and there are no demarcations between the songs. It's just a band and what they have to say, the story they have to tell.
And we're not just talking about rock music. I mean, in soul, you have Marvin Gaye. What's Going On comes out in 1971, and that's so much more than a collection of songs. It's, a societal reflection on war, poverty, environmental issues, told through this lush instrumentation. I mean, a masterpiece.
Totally. So on the heels of the 70s, which is, like you said, kind of this glorious Mount Rushmore era for
music,
long form music, the LP seemed inevitable. It seemed unshakable. Maybe this is when people kind of started taking it for granted.
Yeah.
And the next innovation,
the CD,
enrolls the compact disc, the CD, which came about in the 1980s. And these were also small plastic discs, but they promised a cleaner sound. They were far more portable and storable. They took up less room.
Yeah.
And most importantly, they allowed for a longer runtime. I mean, albums could now be stretched to over 70 minutes.
Wow.
The album as an art form continued to thrive in this era. CDs offered yet another boundary-pushing format for music.
It's the 80s.
It's the 80s. Yeah,
it's a great time.
So yeah, in the 80s, you had albums like Michael Jackson's Thriller and Paul Simon's Graceland, which really took advantage of the extent of creative freedom, and this trend carried through the 90s with Radiohead's OK Computer, Nirvana's Nevermind, among countless other examples, which landed on listeners' ears as sprawling, ambitious records. People and musicians had solidified the creative possibilities of what an album can be, do, sound like, etc.
And I think some listeners lamented losing that analog warmth and crackly charm that a vinyl LP has, but convenience always has a way of winning out.
Enter
the 21st century.
With the rise of MP3s and digital downloads and eventually platforms like Napster and iTunes, people could cherry pick songs. You could eschew the album as a art form altogether. You didn't have to treat an album like, even if you heard music for the first time in that way, you could flag your favorite songs, pull them for your iPod, or
that's what I would do, honestly.
And in a sense, curate an album all your own,
made up of the singles that you liked,
which is beautiful in its way, but also started to chip away at the dominance of the album, not just music being sold as full albums, but the way artists would approach the music they make.
Yeah, some of the messages I think were starting to get lost.
And singles rose to prominence once again. I mean, it was a full circle moment. But it's worth noting that just because our listening habits changed and continue to change doesn't mean that artists have lost sight of what makes the album format, the long play format, so artistically exciting. I mean, you've got, just to name a few examples, Kanye West's My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, even Beyonce's self-titled album.
Right.
I mean, for me, Wilco's Yankee Hotel Foxtrot is like a Y2K
I've
adjacent.
Never listened to it.
Wow,
I'm so
Julia,
sorry.
What a gorgeous slice of Americana.
It's next on my list. I promise.
But albums like these proved that artists still cared about creating albums that had these cohesive, consistent through lines, and that these albums could still be artistic statements that demanded full attention and to be heard in full.
I mean, we now live in the streaming era. We're not going back. Streaming is only going to continue to evolve, and who knows what the next platform is. But currently, it's Spotify and Apple Music. And they give us a nearly endless library of music that we can have in our pockets and in our ears at all times.
I could not have listened to over 750 albums this year without streaming. Right. So, despite all that we're saying on this podcast, which you're probably or possibly listening to on a streaming platform already, it certainly has its upsides, this era of music we live in. I mean, it would be my whole life savings to have had to buy 750 vinyls worth of music to listen to.
Yeah.
That being said, we feel, at least as music lovers and listeners and the hosts of this podcast, that the streaming era has its downsides, for sure. Not even just in terms of like how artists are paid and all of the issues around that side of the music industry, but purely as listeners.
So I think the question remains, in a world of infinite choice and instant access, can the album survive as an art form?
I think yes. I think the album lives on. I mean, artists continue to release albums that insist on being heard as a complete thought, that are better for being heard all the way through.
Yeah.
Often they're chock full of songs that you'd love to hear on your own, but they still, when you give them the chance, offer listeners the opportunity to slow down, sit with an artist's vision, to let yourself be rewarded by a listening experience that is, like we said, greater than the sum of its parts.
I think we have a job to do. We have to convince the world that the album, as a start to finish idea, is worth it.
Totally.
And I think for me, that's what For the Record is all about. Rediscovering the magic of the album as a complete experience. And with that, we're going to wrap up this history lesson. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed. Once again, I'm Julia.
And I'm Isaac.
And this is For the Record Podcast. You can find us on Instagram at For the Record Podcast. And if you want to email us with suggestions, with album recommendations, our email is
4 as in the number, D as in Diana, Record Podcast. That's 4D Record Podcast at gmail.com.
This is why you don't let boys make the email.
All the other good ones were taken, we had to get creative.
So email us. You can find us on Instagram.
We'll see you on the next episode.
See you soon.